So we're dealing with, is Jesus God? That's the question we're going to be dealing with today. And the thing is he claimed to be deity, because that's really the question. Did he claim deity for himself? If he didn't, then, game over, right? We don't need to deal with it. But if he did claim deity, then we got to figure that out. And so the question is who is Jesus? Who is he in fact? Every religious system wants to include Jesus in their system. They change him, they redefine him, but they all include him. I'll just kind of run through a few of them. In Islam, Jesus, who they call Isa, is considered to be a messenger of God, just one of the messengers of God. That's pretty much all he is, and he is someone who just communicates God's truth to us. He's one that brought the Injil, and the Injil would be the Gospel or the New Testament. But what you'll find is that Muslims will say, oh, well, the church changed the New Testament, so we don't have to read it, because they're encouraged to read the New Testament. I mean, that's something that you can ask a Muslim today. Are you supposed to read the Injil? And they say, yes, but, and then their caveat is that the church changed it. We're going to talk about that later in the presentation. The Baha'i faith considers him a manifestation of God, and so he's just a series. There are a series of personages who reflect God in this world, almost like a theophany, and so he's just kind of one of those. He comes and he's just a manifestation, which almost sounds. And Baha'i, if you remember, it comes out of Islam, but it almost sounds almost a little Hinduistic as well, or a little pantheistic to call him a manifestation. Judaism, they just reject the idea that Jesus is God, that there is any kind of, any person of the Trinity. I mean, they're very monotheistic. They struggle with, the Trinity or triune God idea, and so they would not put him in any category other than not someone that they would follow. In the Druze faith, I thought that was kind of interesting. He's one of God's important prophets, but then they call him the greatest imam and the incarnation of ultimate reason. And so they see that there was another guy, this guy Hamza ibn Ali, who was a reincarnation of Jesus. And in fact, Jesus kind of messed up. And so this guy made sure that Jesus got crucified and took him off the scene. I mean, so that's their view of who Jesus is. In Scientology, he was, and I thought there was an interesting statement, below the level of operating thetan. I mean, he's not even a thetan. He's below that level. I mean, they don't even put him in a very high category in Scientology. Buddhists really have no particular official view of Jesus. I mean, there's a lot of individual Buddhists that might have writings about him, but in terms of as a religious idea, they would just, a lot of people would say, well, he's similar to Buddha. Jesus and Buddha are pretty much similar. In Hindu religions, they would say him as a spiritual teacher. And so they would, some would even include him as in their 330 million gods and goddesses as a deity. Jehovah's Witnesses would put Jesus as God's first creation. They would call him a God, not the God, and so therefore he's just someone who's super angel. I mean, he's involved in creation, but he is a created being, and so they would see him that way. Mormons would see him as a perfect example of how to live life. And so when you look at all these different religious ideas, and somebody says, oh, they're all the same, all these religious ideas are the same, well, we have a very different view of who Jesus is. In fact, there's a lot of early false views of Jesus. One, and you see the word that I have highlighted, adoptionism, where the idea is that they want to protect, God's deity. They want to safeguard true humanity, and so they say, well, God just adopted him. And usually it's at the baptism of John when the Spirit comes on. They say that's the moment in which he was adopted as the Son of God, and he wasn't always the Son of God. Gnostic promoted the idea that matter is evil, which is really a Greek idea. And so this idea that if matter is evil, then how can God possess a body? So therefore he didn't possess a body. It's just a make-believe body or just a pretend body or just an apparition. And so they were called Docetists. Then there was the modalism. Modalism is that God is in the process of change. And so in one moment he's God, in another moment the Father, in another moment he's the Son, in another moment he's the Spirit. And it's one of the reasons why, we can't come up with a good view in terms of a picture, of an idea, or of what does this look like, this 3-in-1 idea. Do we know anything that's like it in the world? And the answer is no, we don't. Some have used the idea of water and they say, okay, at the triple point of water, usually 32 degrees, you can drive down the street and you'll see a puddle of water, you'll see ice, and you'll see steam coming up, the 3 different types of water. And so you'd say that's what it's like. And yet that's really more a picture of modalism, because it's changing all the time. So it doesn't really reflect exactly that idea. You'll also hear this called Sabellianism as well. Another false view is subordinationist, who would say that he is subordinated actually and in essence to the Father. And so, there is a subordination of Jesus to the Father. He says, not my will, but your will be done, in terms of his humanity especially, but in terms of he wasn't subordinated to the Father in terms of his essence. And so that's something that's key to know. When you hear someone talk about subordination, there is a functional subordination that is going on among the Trinity. The Council of Nicaea, some of the early church councils, they were really struggling with some of these issues, and they had a lot of people that were throwing out alternate views. They were throwing out adoptionism. I mean, you have these guys Eutychius, and Sabellianism, and you had Nestorianism. I mean, you have all these different guys that were coming up and saying, well, I think he's 2 separate people, or no, I think he's a mixture of the two, and so you have a third essence and they were trying to just wrestle with these ideas of who was Jesus in fact. And so the Council of Nicaea came up with the begotten, not made. And so this idea that he was not a created being, it's not something that he was somehow created from the beginning of time, like the Jehovah's Witnesses would say today. He was as the same substance or essence as the Father. And there was this idea of homoousios. That was the Greek term that they used when they were throwing these things around. You'll see the author of Hebrews, who defends and affirms the deity of Christ when he says he's the exact imprint of his nature. And if you're missing that, he's saying he's much superior to the angels. And so he's eliminating and beginning to qualify, who is this Jesus in fact? Well, he's greater than the angels. Who is he in fact? He's the exact imprint. He's exactly in the same character as the image of God. Then another council, in Constantinople in 381, 1 divine substance, 3 divine persons. That terminology began to be used about this idea, and people today are still struggling with what's the right term to use. They struggle with the term persons, and yet it's still an appropriate term. It's still in the creeds. I mean, so it's an appropriate term to use, but it doesn't quite capture. There's not a word that captures it. And when you think about it, you think about God in his triune nature. There's nothing going to be on this planet that we can compare him to, because he's unique. And since he's unique, that means that there's nothing that's going to exactly point to who Jesus or who God is, or who Jesus is. That one person and 2 natures. That was stated more clearly in Chalcedon, and I went ahead and put the whole creed up here. I know that's a lot. There's no way you can read all that by the time I switch the slides. But the two to highlight is truly God and truly man, or fully God, fully man. You hear that statement. That came about in Chalcedon in this creed in 451. And then this one statement, this one phrase, really important to know, because it addresses all the different issues of who Jesus is. 2 natures, without confusion, without change, without division, without separation. And each one of those phrases addresses one of the issues. Without separation deals with Nestorianism, and without confusion would deal with Eutychianism. And so you'd have each of these words are really crucial. And what you'll find is you think, okay, yeah, we don't have Eutychianism today. We don't have Docetism today. We don't have Nestorianism. And it's like, oh yeah, we do. We don't call it that, we call it something else, but it's still around. Some of these age-old concepts of Jesus are in some religious ideas, and to have a familiarity with those ideas is certainly important when we talk about Christ. Because one of the things that I find is if we tell people, you need to receive Christ, well, which Christ are we talking about here? And do they understand which Jesus we're talking about? And sometimes they don't. And you'll find that that becomes a great conversation point for you with people from other faiths, other directions, other religious ideas. You can begin to talk about in a little bit of an intelligent way. If you're at least exposed to this, you know that there's a difference. And so it's important for us to understand that. And one of the reasons I think as well is because when you think about the fact if I were Satan and I wanted to confuse people about any single topic or any single thing, what would it be? It'd be about the person of Christ. I want people to be so confused they don't know what they're talking about. And so you see this through history. It's just boom, 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 all these different ideas about who Jesus is. Well, it's important for us to know. Where are we holding heresy in regard to our understanding of who Christ is when we're trying to think about him? And so I hold to the Chalcedonian Creed. I think it's a great creed. It's something that Christians all across the globe hold to. And so it's something to understand. And of course, it has a lot of other language in there as well. So the implication is there's a distinction between the natures, two natures, one person. Fully God, fully man. If you just understand that simple statement, that cuts through a lot of what you'll see out there. And so it's something important for us to have a good grip on. So let's look at the scriptures that talk about some of this. It says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, what you'll find is one of the arguments that people use against this verse is that when you look at the original language, and in fact, I'll skip a slide and come back to it. Here you have in this statement, it's in the first, and I have the Greek line here, and you may not be able to read that. That's just scribbling to you, right? And some of you may know it, especially if you're in a fraternity or sorority, at least know the letters. This word is theos, and that one's logos, and then you have was the word. God was the word. That's the word order of the original. And you have to, in Greek, in any language, when you're reading it, it's not always in the same word order that we have, and sometimes it's for emphasis, because you want to emphasize God was the word. And so that, or you'd say the Word was God. So you put something forward in the sentence if you want to emphasize it. Well, so it emphasizes God. And so in the Jehovah's Witnesses, because there's no article here, the absence of the article in their New World Translation, they'll say, and the Word was a God. That's the way it'll be translated. If you're at Half Price Books, sometime you can pull one of those off the shelf and look at it and see, it says the Word was a God. And they say, see, there's no article here. And then if they're talking to you, they'll say, hey, there's no article. And so therefore, it's a God. Jesus is a God. Because later, down in verse 14, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, it's clear that the Word is talking about Jesus. And so it's saying, John is saying Jesus is God, but it's easy to confuse it, and they use that one little argument. Well, there's a rule of grammar, and the reason I say the uses of the Greek, and I know you haven't taken Greek, and that's okay, but understanding there's a deal called Caldwell's rule, and in Caldwell's rule, you can have a definite predicate nominative, which is the noun portion. You have a being verb, am, was, were, is, been, being, those types of words. And if they precede the verb, they're usually anarthrous, which means they don't have the article. And so that's typical. That's a typical Greek construction. And so when you see this Greek construction, you'll see, okay, no article there. And so since there's no article, then it doesn't have to be indefinite. It can be a definite noun. And so basically, you don't have to have the article. Caldwell's rule says that. Now, Caldwell's rule, and this is I got from Dan Wallace, who has a Greek grammar that's well known and people have used broadly. He says that it usually means that it's qualitative. In other words, their natures are the same. Doesn't necessarily mean that they're the same person. Which would make a lot of sense if you take a triune God. They're not the same person, they're separate persons, the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, and yet their natures are the same. They're in essence the same, so it's still a very strong statement. What you'll hear from Jehovah's Witnesses about this is they'll typically say, yeah, well, that's true, but that may be true, but that's man's rule. And this, this is God's word, and so and it's like, well, that argument proves a little too much, because all of grammar is man's rules, and God decided and chose to use a Greek language, not a heavenly language, in order to communicate His truth. And so God knew what He was doing in selecting that, and in the word selection that was made necessary. Caldwell's rules, all it means is that it can be a definite noun. And in fact, the character is very idea of them being the same is very strong. So it's still a very strong passage. Don't let them knock you off of that passage because they say, oh, it's not a definite article, and therefore that one's out. And you say, oh, okay, well, let me give you a stronger argument. No, I think it's important to understand. Here's another place, and I looked at the New World Translation on this one too, and they translate it almost exactly like this. And it says, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into His hands and that He had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. And so you would say, where's He coming from? God the Father, right? Where's He going back to? God the Father. Interesting. If you take their idea, there's no article on the first one and there is an article on the second one. And yet in the New World Translation, it doesn't say they came from a God and coming to the God. Because if you're consistent, say, well, hey, there's no article here in John 13:3, so that should say a God. So where did He come from? Which God? Which God is there if there's not the Father or the Son? I mean, you're talking about both of them. So what's this other one? Is there a third God? And so all of a sudden, you show you don't have to have the article in order for a noun to be definite. And therefore, if it's true in John 13:3, even according to their own New World Translation, then it certainly can be true in John 1:1. And so that's the whole purpose of using this. Now, this was an argument that Roy Zook came up with, and he wrote a letter open letter to Jehovah's Witnesses. It's a fascinating article if you ever get a chance to read it. It's a little older now, but it's still got some great stuff in it. And so a noun in Greek doesn't have to have the article to be a definite noun. So John 1:1 is still a good passage, a strong passage that talks at the very least, about God and the Father and God the Son being one in essence. And so it carries that idea. Jesus did claim to be God. Jehovah's Witnesses will also say that He never claimed to be Jehovah. He's not Jehovah God. And Jehovah is another, they used a different set of vowels to come up with that. It's basically, we use the term today, Yahweh is a more current use of the vowels that are chosen. Yahweh takes the vowels from the being verb and puts them in with Yahweh. That's what they figure, because He's the I am, the being verb I am. He has always been, He always has been, He always will be. He is the great I am. He's outside of time, He's transcendent, He's beyond all things. And so, but He's very much everywhere as well. And so when you look at what Jesus said, He says, I am. And some would question, okay, what is He saying? He was just saying that He was before Abraham, right? Well, the problem with that is, if He would have said that, if He was just saying I was before Abraham, He would have said I was. He wouldn't have said I am. Jesus said, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was born, I am. And He's really looking at Exodus 3:14. In Exodus 3:14, when Moses is talking to God, Yahweh, Jehovah, he's saying, who do I say He sent me? And He goes, well, say I am sent you. I am who I am. Say I am has sent you. What is Jesus saying? I am. Before Abraham was born. Not I was, I am. I am the great I am of Exodus 3:14. I am Yahweh. I am Jehovah. That's what Jesus is saying. Small wonder that they picked up stones to throw at Him, because He hadn't. They were just beginning to try to grasp who He was. Oh wow, This has all the little. So Jesus claims to be God. Yeah, you like that? How it kind of just appears there. There are two alternatives. His claims were either false or they were true. If they were false, he either knew that they were false, and therefore he was a liar. He didn't know that they were false, and so he's a lunatic. Or his claims were true, and he's Lord and God. And then we have a choice. We can either accept Christ or reject him. I mean, that's the old Lord, Liar, Lunatic from C.S. Lewis. He came up with that idea, and I love this little diagram. It's been fascinating to me, and it's just very clear. He's either a liar, lunatic, or Lord. He's not a good moral teacher. He's not a manifestation of God. I mean, all the other things that people say about him, he's not all those things. He's either one of these three things. And you've got to decide, based on the evidence that we have, is he truly who he said he was? And we're going to look at that. The Apostle Paul said that he was full deity. That was his conclusion. For in him, the whole fullness of deity dwells bodily. You see Paul also teaching that Jesus rose from the grave. So here's a guy who was originally an enemy, hostile to the cross, killing people, and his conclusion and the gospel that he preached, Christ died for our sins, and that he was raised on the third day. And so those two things make up the gospel presentation that Christ or that Paul taught. And so he had a two-part gospel. A lot of times we have a four-part gospel. Kind of interesting. And when I talk about the gospel, you'll hear me talk about the four aspects of what we say. We say God loves you, Christ died for you, or you sinned, Christ died, and you decide, right? I can say the gospel in 8 words. God loves, men sins, Christ died, you decide, right? Where's the resurrection in that? We kind of leave the resurrection out in our typical presentation. Paul had a two-part gospel. Christ died for your sins. He rose from the grave. And then everything else in that first part of 1 Corinthians 15 is proof of that. His proof for that Christ died, well, it was according to the Scriptures, and you'd have to go back and look at the Scriptures, and he was buried. So you have biblical proof, empirical proof. You got two types of proof, and he does the same thing when he talks about the resurrection. That it was raised according to the Scriptures, notice that phrase, and that he appeared. And then it gives you all the people that he appeared in front of. Now it's interesting, all the lists that he has there. Appeared to more than 500 at one time. And when you think about 500 witnesses, the majority of those people would still be around. They could be questioned. You could go and ask them, hey, you said you saw the resurrection. I mean, Paul was telling me, they squealed on you. They said, tell me about this. What did you see? Well, I saw him alive after he died. I mean, you can imagine those conversations. It would have been wonderful to be able to have those kinds of conversations. Jesus appeared to hostile witnesses. I mean, he didn't appear just to people who would be inclined to believe on him. I mean, we see that with Thomas. Thomas wasn't inclined to believe. Thomas was a skeptic. He was a doubter. We call him Doubting Thomas. Probably have to apologize to that guy someday when we see him up in heaven. And I was thinking about that. I was thinking, man, I'm so glad Thomas was in the crowd. Because he raised question that I would raise. I want to stick my finger in his side. I want to stick my finger in the wounds in his hands. I mean, I want some empirical proof here. I want to know this is truly the same guy. Saul of Tarsus didn't even have that opportunity. He was just going out and killing Christians and trying to shut down churches. And then Jesus appeared before him on the Damascus Road and completely changed and transformed this guy. They weren't just hallucinating. That's one of the arguments that has been brought up is that, well, maybe they were all just hallucinating and they were all just, at the same time. 500 people really hallucinating at the same time and they all saw the same thing? That doesn't make any sense. And especially over a period of 40 days, psychologically, that's insupportable. And so that doesn't fit. Some would say Jesus just swooned. The idea there is he didn't die, he merely fainted from exhaustion. You'll see this in the Quran. They declare that he didn't die on the cross, that he just feigned death and that he resuscitated. And so that's part of the concept there. And so the question is, well, did that happen? Did they lay him on the cold slab? I mean, it is possible for a person that has gone through a lot to be laid on a cold slab, to revive, whatever, because of the coolness of the thing. And so it makes a little bit of sense that that's possible. But when you think about how badly he was beaten, that guys who, when he was on the cross, people who were experts at death. I mean, these guys they were used to seeing people die on a cross. They broke the legs of the other two and didn't him because he was already gone. A guy stuck a spear in his side, and out came blood and water. So it's separated. And the fact that it's separated, according to Journal of American Medical Association article that was done in '86, said that's a certain sign of death because it, and they described it medically, but that was evidence that he actually had died. And so, and I won't try to go into all the technical details of that. You'll have to read the article, which you have to pay $40 for, I think, for the JAMA now. And so here's the thing that a skeptic, this is a skeptic, a guy named David Strauss wrote. It says, it's impossible that a being who had stolen half dead out of the sepulcher, who crept about weak and ill, wanting medical treatment, who required bandaging, strengthening, and indulgent, and who still at last yielded to his sufferings, could have given to the disciples the impression that he was a conqueror over death and the grave. I mean, this is a skeptic saying this. He says it doesn't make sense. From any perspective, the Prince of Life, an impression which lay at the bottom of their future ministry, such a resuscitation could only have weakened the impression which he had made upon them in life and death, and at the most could only have given it an voice, but could only by no possibility have changed their sorrow into enthusiasm and have elevated their reverence into worship. And I think he's right. I mean, that wouldn't have inspired anybody to follow Christ. And so I don't think that makes sense. That article that I told you about that was written in '86, there's an updated version in Baylor University Medical Center in a 2021 article references that article, but then talks about some of the other things and really actually even had a chart, and you can look that one up, but had a chart that had what the most popular views among doctors are that are believers that are kind of looking at Christ, what did he die of? And asphyxiation was what they would say was the because when you're hanging like that, your arms, whenever they're pulled up, you can't breathe. That's the reason you have to push up on the block, and yet it's painful because it's nailed on a nail. And so you push up, and pretty soon you just tire out. You can't hold yourself up anymore, and you suffocate, and you die. And so they said that's probably, that's the most common about how or what the cause of death might have been. Was the body stolen by the disciples? Some would say, the disciples stole the body, that's why there's no body. I mean, this is all very fitting for Easter, right, as we approach Easter. Well, here's the disciples. I mean, think about their mentality. They're not even hanging around when Jesus gets arrested. They don't show a lot of bravery. I mean, they take off. Even Peter's lying about even having known him. And here, before he was saying, "Hey, I'll die with you. I'll go to the nth degree with you." And yet, suddenly now they became brave and they stole the body when there's a Roman contingent out in front of the grave. Doesn't make a lot of sense that they somehow, doesn't psychologically make sense. If the Roman authorities had moved Christ's body, some accuse the Roman authorities of doing it. Well, why didn't they just produce the body? All they do is parade the body around Jerusalem, game over. There's no longer any argument. They didn't have the body, that's why. Did they all go to the wrong tomb? That's another argument. Oh, they went to the wrong tomb. They messed up. They all went to the wrong tomb, and everybody followed the next person, and pretty soon they were all there. Well, if I was Joseph of Arimathea and everybody's going, tomb's empty, what am I going to do? I'm going to go check the tomb that I owned, that I spent a lot of hours having people, because it was a newly hewn tomb, so he'd just been there, so he's going to go and check it. I would check it out. Now, we don't have that he did check it out, but it doesn't make any sense that he did, that he wouldn't go, oh yeah, he isn't here. And when you look at the proximity, this is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and this is the distances. I've been to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre 5 times, and you have upstairs, you have under glass and a bunch of all sorts of religious relics. If you look carefully, you can see, hey, this is the top of the hill here. And when you're walking the Via Dolorosa, you're going uphill. So you're walking up all these steps, going up to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. You get in the Church of Holy Sepulchre, you go up to the second floor, and there's this rock. Well, you can almost see, if it weren't for this column here, you could almost see where the tomb of Christ would have been. I mean, it's all under one roof. It's not that far. It's not like it would be hard to find. Here's a picture of the inside of the church. Here's the stairs going up to the other, and then you'll notice the tomb is this way. I wish I would have taken a picture from up here and maybe get as much of it as I could so you can see it's not that far away. I mean, it's really close proximity. If you were to draw it what it would have looked like, I mean, you would have had the hill here and you'd have had the tomb there. I mean, it would have been hard to miss, hard to go to the wrong one. A side view that somebody drew of this has, and apparently there's this outcropping that was cut off, but you would have the two very close together. These are the two domes that you have for the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So it's like really hard to imagine. Now, there's a lot of other places that people have said, oh, well, this is the wrong location. It's actually another location. And you see the garden tomb. And people, that's a second high. There's about 11 different places that people have said, but the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the garden tomb are the two most likely in a lot of people's thinking. The problem with and I've done a lot of reading on that, the problem with the garden tomb is that it's not designed like a first century tomb. A first century tomb usually had one room behind another. In the garden tomb, it's beside each other. You would also have in a typical first century, this is a typical first century tomb. 3 things that you'll see in a typical first century tomb. An arcosolium, single archway. Under it would have been a slab. This one's broken, but there would have been a slab there, and that's where they would have laid the body to prepare it. And then they would put them in a kokim, which looks like a bread oven, for an ancient bread oven. They would slide the body in there, leave it about a year for it to become just bones. And then you take the bones and put them in a box called an ossuary. And so that's your typical first century tomb. That one we see on the Mount of Olives. That's where I've seen this one. And I took this picture. And so you have, when you look at the garden tomb, it doesn't have any of those features really. It doesn't have an arcosolium, doesn't have kokim. It has a place where there might have been a rolling stone, what they say, but it's hard to know. The thing I love about the garden tomb, and we have communion there, is because it looks like what you expect it to look like. You think, okay, this is the setting, and there is a little hill that looks like a skull, and so, it's the place of the skull, right? And so it fits that. And so some people, now you can get into what it was carved with, and actually if you could go and have be better eyes than mine, but be able to see what kind of device, and they use a certain device where the garden tomb was done, and it's on a hill with 900-year-old tombs. There were certain devices during the time of David that they used to carve a tomb, and then if you knew that, you could look at that. We don't really have anything to compare to in the tomb of Christ in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre because it got destroyed quite a bit. It was destroyed in around the 600 ADs by the Muslims as they came in, and then when Hadrian took over in about 135, before that, in 135, he built a temple to Zeus over that spot, and people would typically do that in ancient times. I'm going to build my temple over your temple or over your holy place because I want to show my God dominates your God. That was kind of the idea. And so it's so destroyed, and I think thankfully it is. Otherwise, we would see a lot more worship of the location, and there's still plenty. So I think it probably the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is the legitimate spot, but it just doesn't, it's got a building over it, so it's hard to see. It doesn't seem natural. The garden tomb is left in more of a natural state, and so you can see more in that regard. Some say, I think you got to deal with the fact that the Roman seal was broken. The Roman seal people feared breaking the Roman seal, because if you break a Roman seal, then you're just flaunting their authority, and you're basically at a point where you're challenging Roman authority. And so, because if they say you can't go, none shall pass, and then you just pass, then you're definitely challenging them. And so here's these scared and running away disciples, and you're saying, oh, they're willing to come in and challenge Roman authority directly and try to steal the body. It doesn't make sense that they would be able to do that. This is a picture of a Rolling Stone tomb that's on the way to Megiddo. It's in the, I think it's in the Megiddo Pass, maybe in the Yokneam Pass, but it's a first century tomb. It has the stone still, and a lot of times what happens is these things, they discover them and then somebody comes along and destroys them, but this is one that I love this, and I see it every time. Used to, we could walk up in it and crawl in it and stuff, but then people started, it's right on the side of the road, so people get hit. And so they started putting guardrails and all sorts of stuff, and now our bus just stops and you can look out the window. But I got to take this picture before all that. When you look at the fact that the tomb was empty, if you were saying, oh, well, the tomb's empty, and it really wasn't, I mean, you're in Jerusalem. That's where it all happened. And so it's not like you're some off in Timbuktu. You're in the same city. People can go and check out the site for themselves. I mean, so they can ask people. They can go check out the site for themselves. I mean, so it doesn't make sense that you could sustain something that wasn't true and say, hey, there's an empty tomb, when in fact there really wasn't. Jewish and Roman sources they didn't challenge the idea of the empty tomb. And so Dr. Paul Mayer calls this positive evidence from a hostile source. And so it's the strongest kind of historical evidence. If you got your enemy saying the same thing as you're saying, the tomb was empty, then it makes sense that the tomb was empty, and you got to deal with an empty tomb. There may be a lot of reasons for an empty tomb, but you got to deal with that. The fact that the stone was rolled away, all the gospel writers noted that. And it was a large stone, and so it wasn't somebody could just come and push a button, like your garage door, and it opens up. I mean, you had to have some strength, some muscle. And in fact, the women approaching the tomb said, "Who's going to roll the stone away for us?" They were wondering about that because, I mean, here's some women, and they still didn't feel like that they could do it, and there were 2 or 3 of them at least. And so it must have been a difficult stone to move. And of course, some of this stuff, just so you know, one of the great sources, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, or Evidence for the Resurrection by Josh McDowell, and his son has come along, Sean McDowell, and carried the torch as well on some of these things. Gamaliel didn't argue the point of the empty tomb. He argued a different point. Well, maybe God's in this. We'll know for sure as time will tell. I mean, that was basically his argument. You have, and here's what I love. I was thinking about this whole years ago. Okay, let's put all the little details into place. You got these scared disciples. They're going to go steal the body, right? So they're tiptoeing up to the tomb. Imagine yourself, you're scared and trembling. You're tiptoeing to the tomb. You're going to steal the body. And there's a Roman guard there that they, at threat of death, and you look at that, disciplinary procedures, if they fall asleep, somebody's going to die. They're going to draw lots and somebody's going to die or whatever, because you've had one job to do, protect the body, and you didn't do it. And then you say, we fell asleep. And that was the story going around, we fell asleep. You fell asleep and nobody was disciplined, nobody was killed for that? That doesn't make any sense. They would have flawless attention to detail, according to Dr. George Curry, who did a lot of study on Roman military discipline. Says you're going to have you're going to have a flawless attention to duty, especially in the night watches when you knew you were going to fall asleep. I mean, you're keeping each other awake. You're going to make sure somebody's awake, and that it's not nobody takes the body, right? So. Well, the tomb wasn't totally empty because grave clothes were in there, right? So imagine this picture. Disciples who are afraid, tiptoeing up, Roman guards who are asleep, shouldn't be, doesn't make sense, but imagine that they're asleep. You sneak up, and now you're going to quietly, ever so quietly, move this huge stone. I mean, it's going to be making a noise, right? I mean, there's no way you can quietly move this huge stone. It's going to be scraping the side of the tomb. I mean, it's going to be rolling in this. I mean, there's no way you're not going to wake up the guys who are sleeping. I mean, unless they were drunk or something. I mean, and that would even carry a more severe penalty. And so here you've got them sneaking in. And not only do they sneak in and they move the stone, they break the seal, they're scared to death, they should lose their lives, they roll the stone away. Then they go in and take their time and decide, hey, let's just take the grave clothes off and leave them kind of like they were, and let's fold this one, the face cloth up and put it in a corner. I mean, it's like, that doesn't make any sense. Let's grab the body and run, right? So to leave the grave clothes doesn't make any sense. I mean, none of this makes any sense if you take that kind of view. And you wouldn't just leave why would you even unwrap the body in the first place? Much less the fact that it was completely undisturbed. And if the Shroud of Turin has any authenticity to it, which, there's debate about that, then, basically you have Christ just going through the cloth and apparently leaving a photographic image on the cloth. And so, I mean, it just doesn't make any sense it takes more faith to believe that all of that happened with these disciples than that fact that he rose from the grave. I mean, that's almost, it just psychologically doesn't make any sense. Christ appeared with them alive on several occasions, and the number of eyewitnesses is substantial, and it would be a strong evidence that he actually rose from the grave. Now, some would say, well, they tampered with the Scriptures. The early church, this all didn't happen. The early church has tampered with the Scriptures, and so they changed the account. And it was just creative product of the early church. It's a novel, it's a myth, and made up. Well, Nabil Qureshi, in his book, No God But One, he also wrote the book, Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. And he's since gone on to be with the Lord. He had stomach cancer. He said that if someone in the early church history had the authority and power to recall all the texts, destroy them, and issue official copies, then yeah, that could happen. And he said, in fact, that happened in Islam. In Islam, there was a caliph who came along, didn't like all the different Qurans that were out there, and so he gathered them all. It was very early on, so he gathered them all, and he put them in one place, burned them, and issued an official copy. And so now you have one copy of the Quran. And so they'll say, we have one copy of the Quran. You got all these different manuscripts of the Scriptures, so something's off. Well, nobody had ruling power over Christendom for 300 years until the time of Constantine. There was no collection. Well, you go that long and making all these copies, there's no way that you could pull them all together. You'd have had to do it early on. You couldn't wait 300 years and then pull them all together because there would still be ones floating out there. There's none floating out there. There's none that have any other readings other than the ones that we have. And so, yeah, there's some that have a little bit of variance in wording on this copy or that copy, but when it comes down to it, even if you threw out all the verses that had a little bit of a discrepancy, you still have plenty. And the thing is it's not that we don't have enough of the Scriptures, that we got a little too much. We got it all because of the way that people valued the Scriptures. When they saw something as written, especially in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, they say, well, this is what's written, but I think this is what should be read. So there was a Kethiv Kareh reading they'd write in the margin, and they would write that. So they'd say, well, here's what's written, but I think it's supposed to be this. Because they valued the text so highly, they wouldn't even make the change that they thought should be made. We would just change a typo and say, oh, it's got the wrong spelling, and you just go change it with your computer, right? They wouldn't even do that because they had high regard for the Scriptures. Also, when you think about the Scriptures being tampered with, if you're going to tamper with the Scriptures, wouldn't you make your argument stronger rather than weaker? It seems like you would. And so to have Mary Magdalene as the first person on the scene, she's your first witness. Let me call my first witness, right? If you're in a judicial scene, let me call my first witness. And the first witness is someone whose testimony would not be allowed in a court of law in those days. Sorry, gals, but that's the way it was, right? And so, but Scripture lifting up women, uses them as the first witness, and so it's proof positive that this is an honest telling of the story. It's not a fabricated one, it's not a changed one, it's not made up, it's not made to look stronger, it's just simply telling what happened. And so the evidence is really pointing to the fact that the scriptures were not tampered with rather than were tampered with. There's also a psychological change in the disciples that can't be explained if they stole the body or if he somehow resuscitated. It makes no sense. If you had, and maybe if resuscitated, but especially if they stole the body, but if you had somebody who died in your family and you're grieving, and then 3 days later you're rejoicing, something had to happen, right? I mean, it wasn't just that you got over it real quick. I mean, maybe you didn't like them and you heard the reading of the will or something, I don't know. But there's not going to be this change, this going from grief to elation. So the psychological change in the disciples points to the fact that there was a resurrection, that something significant really happened that day. Christianity is the only world religion that claims an empty tomb. When you look at the four religions that are based on personalities, all the other ones are more on philosophical propositions, but there are four based on personalities. If you take those four personalities, Abraham being one, he was the founder of Judaism. He's in Hebron today, and his tomb is occupied by his body, by his bones. If you take the Buddha, he was cremated on a funeral pyre, and then his body kind of spread out. I guess the ashes spread among different locations, but his body is, this is the common one, is Kushinara, is where, his remains are, some of his remains. If you look at Muhammad, he died in Medina, and his tomb is annually visited. Well, you got his tomb, Muhammad's tomb, and it's occupied. His body's there. You look at Jesus Christ, he died on April 3rd, 33 AD, rose from the dead April 5th, 33 AD, and so his tomb is empty. And so it's the only one that claims an empty tomb for its founder. So, I mean, it's a significant thing that has to be dealt with, has to be talked about. There are a lot of thinkers who try to disprove the resurrection. One of those who was Josh McDowell, he was setting out to refute Christianity and basically brought himself to Christ. I think he was a sophomore, it says, in college. I thought he was older than that, but he was actually a sophomore in college. Another one is Frank Morrison, who was an atheist. He set out to disprove the resurrection in 1930s. Wrote a book called Who Moved the Stone? Fascinating read if you get a chance to read it. And the first chapter is the book that refused to be written, because he set out to disprove the resurrection and he ended up embracing Christ. So Who Moved the Stone by Frank Morrison. And then you have C.S. Lewis, one of the more famous ones, especially back in 1931. He became a Christian after talking to J.R.R. Tolkien, the guy who wrote Lord of the Rings. So, and then another guy in recent times, Lee Strobel, he was a Chicago writer, legal editor. And his wife started going to a church. She was an agnostic. He was an atheist. She came to Christ, and he thought he'd lost his wife. And so he started just kind of investigating for himself whether there was any truth and credibility to Scripture. So he's taking it from a legal perspective, and he ended up leading himself to Christ. So what do we learn of these accounts? Honest story compiled by multiple eyewitnesses, one by a doctor who was trained to observe the details. You see the psychological change of the disciples. You see that they did go to the right tomb. There was a psychological change that can't be explained other than a resurrection. The linen clothes were still left there. I mean, there's a lot of things that point to, and I just highlighted a few. In fact, Clark Pinnock of McMaster University wrote, "Skepticism regarding the historical credentials of Christianity is based upon an irrational basis." It's not rational to just throw out the resurrection, according to him. Well, one of the things that we need to look at is just the prophecies of Scripture. And when you look at Jesus being born in Bethlehem, you see that prophecy in Micah 5:2. "But you, O Bethlehem, Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth from me one who is to be a ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from old, from ancient days. And so this prophecy about the one who was coming, being born in Bethlehem, we see the wise men showing up to Herod, and what do they say? Yeah, look at this verse right here, Micah 5:2. Though, of course, they didn't have the references, the 5:2 part of it in those days. And so they said, yeah, the prophet Micah, he talks about that. Jesus also lived in Zebulun and Naphtali, which you see in Isaiah 9:1. It says, but there will be no gloom for her who is in anguish. In the former time, he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun. Now, Zebulun, if you look at a map, it's in the Galilee. It's where Nazareth is located. It's in the Jezreel Valley. Nazareth is in Zebulun. And the land of Naphtali, that's where Capernaum is. And so he moved to Capernaum, and it says, but the latter times was made glorious by the way of the sea. By the way of the sea. The way of the sea was in Roman times called the Via Maris, the way of the sea. And it would travel along the Mediterranean, but then there was a mountain range called the Mount Carmel mountain range. Recognize that one with Elijah? And so you would have to go and either go through the Oceanium Pass, the Megiddo Pass, or the Dothan Pass. And we see the Dothan Pass back in Joseph's time frame in Genesis. And so that road would go right along the Jezreel Valley and would go north of the Sea of Galilee to get around some of the deep valleys and the mountain ranges. And so Capernaum was on the way of the sea. And so you look at that and think, wow, he fulfills that as well. And then you look at Daniel's 70 weeks, points to the Messiah's death. He says 70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city to finish out transgression, and it goes on. And so it's about your people, Israel, and the holy city, Jerusalem, right? Clear what he's talking about. He says, know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and rebuild Jerusalem to the coming of the Anointed One, there shall be 7 weeks, then for 62 weeks it shall be built. So 69 weeks. There's a 70th week, which is talked. You see references a future time frame, but there are these 69 weeks, and it's translated weeks in a lot of translations. It's really units of 7, 69 units of 7, and so it says the Anointed One shall be cut off. And then the city and the sanctuary is going to be destroyed. What city? The holy city, Jerusalem. And so it's going to be destroyed, and the sanctuary, so the temple. So it's clear what it's talking about. In fact, if you look at it, it's kind of fascinating what Daniel does here. There were 70 years that the Sabbaths were not kept, which happened every 7 years, Sabbath year. There was a 70-year captivity when they were in Babylon. And then he's looking forward 490 years, this prophecy about 70 times 7. Harold Hoehner, in his chronological aspects of the life of Christ in Daniel 9, takes this 69 units of 7. And he says, okay, when's the starting point? When's the ending point? The starting point is the decree of Artaxerxes to rebuild Jerusalem. And that's in Nehemiah. So, and he dates that as March 5th, 444 BC. And you have to read his book if you want, why did he use that date? Why did he use that decree? Then you take that and add it times a 360-day year, which is what they operated from, and you have 173,880 days. So you take March 5th, 444 BC. You subtract that, and you come out to March 30th, 33 AD. That's Palm Sunday. That would be today. Palm Sunday, March 30th, 33 AD, after which the Anointed One is cut off. And a week later, less than a week later, Jesus is cut off. He dies. Now think about this for a minute. You put together Daniel's prophecy and Micah's prophecy and Isaiah's prophecy, 3 prophecies. And you have, okay, if I was going to write and address an envelope to somebody any time in history, Benjamin Franklin, anybody, sometime in history. And I wrote, here's the time frame that they lived. And they lived in Philadelphia, and they lived at, and gave details about them, right? It would go to one person in history. I would be pinpointing one person in history with just 3 pieces of data. So you take Daniel's prophecy, and you know that from March 30th, 33 AD, to 70 AD, because we know that as a firm year for when Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans. Look at that window. That's the time frame that Messiah had to come. And that same Messiah had to be born in Bethlehem, a city that was just a little small village, not even that big today. But you imagine a village of, say, 500 or 600, 700 people. Over a course of time, how many people would have been born there? Not that many, really. Had to come from there. Had to also be someone who had come from Zebulun, somehow significantly Zebulun, and Naphtali, the way of the sea. And who do you have? All of Scripture points to one person in history, Christ. And so you have history pointing to the very thing that happened, that same Christ being the one who rose from the grave with 500 witnesses over a 40-day period. You have all the evidence of the empty tomb where you have a linen cloth, so it wasn't an empty tomb, there was a linen cloth in there. You have the Roman contingent, the Roman soldiers guaranteeing that you have an issue to deal with, you don't have an untended tomb. You have the seal, you have scared disciples who wouldn't have taken on the Roman army. You have them coming and this crazy story about showing up and unwrapping the body and then walking out with this naked body past all these soldiers. I mean, none of it makes any sense except for, and then the psychological change that they believed and went to their death preaching that he rose from the grave, even skeptics. And you have all this evidence that points to the fact that Jesus Christ is who he said he was. He is fully God and fully man. And he fully has power over death, that he rose from the grave, that nobody took his life from him, he gave it freely. He took himself up from the grave. When you look at all those different things, there's a lot that points to us responding in faith to Christ rather than not. And to me, the evidence is overwhelming in every category. So anyway, that's what I have on this, on the person of Christ. Thank you. I know it's a lot, and I know I covered a lot. There are a lot of slides, but I wanted to make sure that you got the big picture and you see the big picture. You can go back and look at details anytime. But to have a picture of the overall, I think is important.